We're now going to modify the species further and create some dense variations, more gnarled variations. One thing I want to note is when you're working with, in this case, the lily of the valley, the spacing between the different plants within the group that are growing is fixed. So if we could create an even denser species just by increasing the length and width of the individual leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and save this scene, grass underscore ground cover underscore eco underscore a underscore 01. So that's the starting point of the ecosystem. Go ahead and close out the scene, start a new scene. Actually, see if we had saved the previous version. And just loading in the customization scene, customizing vegetation underscore grass a underscore 02. And just checking to make sure that units and coordinates are set up correctly. So what we can do if we want to make this into a denser species without too much modification, what we can do is just increase the length and the width of the plant. So that's something a lot denser. We can add and adjust our curl and flexibility, set our randomness, and then we'll also want to go over to the diameter of our other subsets and turn those up to match. And we can lengthen them a little bit. Now this will require a little bit of a larger scale to match up to the current species that we just made. If you want to scale this down, you can. So what I'm going to do is load in that Grassy EcoSystem. We take a look at the size, and then we can grab this new plant and scale it down to match the height and the approximate height. And if you want one to be a longer species than the other, you can make more scale changes. This should hopefully keep our scale even. And I am going to make a few more changes. Just reversing the flexibility and the curl in the other directions. So this is going to be more of a dense, even grass to start out with. And what we're going to do is go over to subset 0 and increase the gnarl and the angle. We can set up a little bit of a droop. And then go over to subset 1, adjust our fall off. And we could have the length and set up a droop there as well. So we could have the leaves still be straight or the blades of grass, but a little bit of bending within the stem, depending on how you want to set it up. So I am going to gnarl it a little bit. And just kind of play around with these settings until we get something that looks like it's going to work well. So that should be a nice denser variation. I am just going to go back to the plant editor, and for all subsets of the trunk and branches, increase the gnarl. And that'll give us a lot more variation. And a little more erratic. But still the leaves will be, or the blades of grass will be mostly even. And that looks like it should be pretty good. So just make sure the scale looks like it's going to work out okay with the other species. This is going to be shorter because the other one is curled. We can do some denser patches here. I'm going to go ahead and just scale it up a little bit. And if you want to start setting up more variations within the material, we're going to go ahead and do that now. So right now we have the grass all pretty much the same material, Grass Blade 01. We're going to go ahead and rename this to Grass Blade B because it's kind of our B group or in the denser group that we're creating. 01, our first variation. And when we go to edit the object in the plan editor, if we select one of the subsets and open up the leaf and petal options and the leaf editor, we can move the hooking point, and that's going to automatically give us a new material we can edit. So we'll go ahead and call this BO2. Now how many you change or how many variations you're going to have. So we could change the individual subsets of these if we wanted one to be more flexible, more randomness. So we can go in there per plant, and we could do that anyway without modifying the material in making it separate. But I do want to make a few changes to the material itself. So we'll go into that new BO2, and I'm going to change that highlight color. First I'm going to increase highlights on this one, and go to the atmosphere editor, and just grab the overall sky color and use that as the highlight color. Maybe we'll go into the setting and just increase the lume value a little bit. A little more saturation. Take our contrast, just bring it down to 5. Let's go ahead and change the bump to 0.03. And if you're working in version 8 and lower, that is going to be an equivalent of 0.15 in your version. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. The further changes I'm going to do within the material of the ecosystem itself. But if we do need to trigger additional material variations, we do have to edit the hooking point in order to make sure that we are allowed variations. I think I might change the flexibility in the other direction. It does look a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and save this out. Just make sure our scale looks okay. That randomness has given us some extra thick blades in there. So we'll just check and see which one needs to be compensated for. And it looks like subset 2 was causing that problem. We'll check our wind. Let's go ahead and same settings. Actually, we'll go ahead and reduce it because it's going to be denser, so we wouldn't want it moving around as much because it's less in the open. Click OK, and that should be good. I'm ready to save out our new species. We'll call it Grass B01. Incorporate our texture maps. Go ahead and save that out. And we're going to be setting up darker colors and different color variations. And we could technically change or override the system gamma for the darker species, but because of the different changes between gamma and different systems, I'd rather come up with a different map for that, or make some changes to the material. So we're going to go ahead and click OK, and now we're going to edit the object. If we can create another variation. Let's just go ahead and take a look after growing new species to see if everything's looking okay. And it looks like maybe this one has a problem with the curl setting. So I'm going to go ahead and change that. It is a good idea to kind of grow new species to make sure that everything is looking alright. We'll need to reset these different settings for the wind, and I am going to overwrite that file I just made. And then we're going to create one more out of this set of images and texture. What I want to do is increase my flexibility, and then I'm going to go into the other subsets and change the length of subset 0. And with the way this is set up with the angle, it's down on the ground, and it does have a nice bit of variation to it. Although I do think the length needs to be modified. I am going to make this one a little bit thicker, and I want to go through and make sure that I'm using a even starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and just reset these different maps or the different subsets. And go to the overall. And I'm going to start from here. So I'm going to reduce the width a little bit, increase the length, and then change the flexibility overall. Curl, we're just going to add a little bit of curl. Go ahead and set it to 50. So we'll do flexibility 50, curl 50. We could also reverse the curl in the other direction. We want to do negative 50. Probably have to go a bit further in order for it to work. Maybe 150, because they do have different ranges and different bounds to produce the output per species. Looks like that should be okay. Maybe the flexibility at 35 and 5 to randomness. And let's go to the all subsets and take a look at that gnarl rating or setting here, and we'll also adjust the angle a little bit and the droop. Maybe increase the width, so all just little bits of tweaking. I'll go ahead and bring that down to negative 10. And that should be alright, and we should still have those additional changes to the materials and the different sets of materials for this one. So if we right click, we have 3 separate materials. I'm going to go ahead and rename this one 3. We could also go in right now and just change highlight settings a little bit. 6 for the global size, 25 for the global intensity, number 3, and then edit number 2, and let's do 55 for the brightness, and let's go ahead and do 15 for the dull to shiny. And that way we have a little more variation throughout the individual surface before we even make it to the ecosystem. So we'll edit the object, and maybe some of those lower stems could be just a little bit shorter. And that should work out pretty well. So we can go ahead and save this species as BO2. So now loading in the BO2 variation, we're just going to create one last dense plant, and then go ahead and start setting up the ecosystem more. What I want to do is take the flexibility and set it up to 125. And I want something a lot more varied and more towards the ground. So we can also go to subset 0 for the trunk and reduce or increase length to get whatever variation we need. Just making sure that everything is sticking up correctly. And then I'm going to make this a little bit of thicker grass. And then go to subset 1. And we're going to change the angle. And just modify our droop so we're going down a little bit, but not to the point where everything's going to be in the ground. And then if we need to, we can increase the length of the stem and maybe the angle of all the subsets to try to get that up a little bit more, and maybe just the flexibility needs to come up a bit. And actually that looks much better. So we'll do a flexibility of 44, curl of -13 for all the leaf petal subsets. And then for the trunk and branches, we've got different variations. And that should be pretty good. So we'll go ahead and edit the object, make sure our wind settings are set correctly, and then we'll go ahead and save that out as BO3. And there was one other one I did want to create, because it will be useful, using the AO2 subset. We want to make a very thin version. Longer grass should work for this. And we don't want a lot of flexibility on it, or curl. These are going to be for brighter leaves, younger ones. We'll open up the material summary. Go ahead and edit that individual plant and just set this to blade and call it young. And then we're going to switch out the image map later. Keeping in mind, if we do switch it out within the ecosystem, the changes are made within the scene and not within the plant species itself. So if you do want to modify the species itself, then you will need to do that at this stage before you save it. That should be good. Go ahead and save that out as AO3, and then young, so we know which one that's going to be for. Okay, so before we go ahead and set up the ecosystem, I want to just create a couple of variations on the blade of grass color map. And what we're going to do is create just a couple of color variations. So we're going to add in a layer effect here. Go ahead and set exposure. And I'm going to go ahead and change the gamma to 0.8 and the exposure to 1.5. And let's go ahead and take the offset and bring it down to -0.048. So this is going to be for the younger leaves, so it's a brighter green. So we'll go ahead and save that. Call it young, and we will need to create another version with the smaller size after this is saved. And I also want to go back and create a darker version. So what we're going to do is -1 for the exposure, and set the gamma to 1.4, turn off the offset, Actually, we'll go ahead and take the gamma and bring it back to 1. Take the exposure negative 0.5. And then we'll take the offset negative 0.01. And we'll just save this as a dark. So color, dark. So then we can open up the young and the dark. And I'm going to actually use a different scale this time, 1024. Let's see if we can get some more detail out of some of them. And I might go back and change that other scale. It's so thin of a material that 1024 isn't that bad. Even 2000 wouldn't be that bad. Because in some areas, it's really washed out and you really can't see the detail. So we'll just save this as the small version. And dark, small. Okay, so with the ecosystem scene open, what we want to pay attention to first is the order in which we're putting these grasses in. What I want to do is pretty much remove the current plants and add them in order of density. And this is going to make it a lot easier to control with a distribution function. So we're going to add a plant, and we'll start with, I think, the densest first, because our dense population should be finished, and I want to transition it to more of the thinner areas. The problem is once the list is created, it's difficult. You can't really move anything around within it. It's once they're added in a specific order, they stay that way. So without having to remove all of them over again, it's a good idea to kind of have an idea of the order in which you want to go with. So I'm going to look for the densest one first. Let's try BO3. And it's going to create and grow the different variations. And we're going to select BO2. So I'm going to go ahead and just add all of these. And then we're going to take a look at the order once it's done. So my population list is set up for BO3, then BO2, then BO1. So those just going kind of in reverse order. And then AO2, and then I have the young variation, and then AO1 is last. So we just take a look right now without making any changes to the presence and just letting view kind of take care of it to begin with, just so we can get an idea of the scene and how it's going to look. And those thicker blades of grass, I think I want to make that species smaller than the 0.1 scale. And I'm pretty sure that's AO1. But to be sure, what we can do is turn on the highlighter. Actually, the highlighter won't really help us in this case because they're all in the same layer. So what we can do is instead change the billboard mode. Go check out AO1. And it does look like that's the one. So let's go ahead and set that to 0.07. And I'm just going to do a render area. And that does look better. Okay, so now we're going to set up the presence. Change back our quality. Presence can be controlled individually. By default, it's set up 1 per instance in the list. This number, if we increase it, in this case, if we set this to 2, we're going to have twice as many of that instance. So they all work in relation with each other. The higher the presence number, the more it's going to show up. Now, we can also control it with the function, which is the distribution, which is what we're going to do. Go ahead and drive it with the function, and this is going to work a little bit differently. I'm going to start by adding in a noise. Let's go ahead and set it to gradient. And depending on the version of Vue you're using, the scale might be a little bit different because some of the noises did change in Vue 9. But if you're using the world standard mode, it should pretty much be the same. Now that we have this connected, if we take a look at the presence, we can see that instead of having kind of a fixed amount, it now relies on a specific range from the function in order for it to show up. So it breaks it down, the values from -1 to 1, and then depending on how many objects are in the instance list, it divides that equally throughout. So anywhere within the function that falls between these values is where that specific instance is going to show. So what we're going to do is use that gradient, the noise, and I'm going to add a filter, set it to the absolute wave. Okay, it looks like contrast at 2 and brightness at 1. And let's take a look at our output. Not fully going through the range. Let's see if we can get something a little higher here. So let's go ahead and actually change it to contrast of 3 and a brightness of -1. And now our output is from 1 to -1. So that's going to be the full range, even though we're going to have, it looks like a lot more of the lower numbers. And go ahead and click OK. And those lower numbers are the denser ones, which is the way I originally wanted it set. It looks like the scale is a little large. We can see that distribution. It might be hard to see for you because the small amount of, or the small instances, but the scale is way too big. There's a big line going all around the outside of the terrain for that noise, so this does need to be reduced. Go ahead and set it to 1 meter, populate. It's looking a little bit better. Maybe 0.5, and then let's go ahead and take the wavelength on the Z and set it to 0.3. That'll give us more change between elevation changes. I'm going to go back to my camera, and I had the focal down a little too low. Let's go ahead and set it to 18. And I'm going to discard the render area. Also, I think because I had Photoshop open with it, I am slowing down a little bit with my interface. So I might go ahead and just save it and restart it, and that's probably the best thing you can do when that starts happening. Because sometimes Photoshop will behave strangely, and I think it all has to do with the video card settings. But let's just go ahead and take a look. I am going to save this as AO2, and then I'm going to render it out. So this is just with the presence set up. We are going to be modifying that a bit more so we don't have giant clumps of just the same thing. We can vary that. Also going to be modifying the density, and we do need to change the overall scaling because right now it's pretty flat, a little boring, but for the most part it's coming along pretty well. Lots of detail, 254 million polys, rendering pretty quickly in the final mode, 2 minutes for 1600 by 900. So just having this stuff close to the camera would be sufficient for animation without killing render times. So what we're going to do is go into our material, scaling orientation, and change our maximum size variation up to 1. And what I also want to do is go to the density and basically reverse this function. What we do need to do is set up a map filter. So we're going to take our output, which is -1 to 1, and we want to output a density range. 1 being the highest amount of overall density, and -1 being basically no plants, no density. So what I want to do is reverse it, so we're going to have the lower value set to 1, and the upper value, we'll go ahead and use 0, and how about 0.8 for that lower value instead of 1. Connect it to our density. So now it's reversed because I've got the lower, which was -1, now at a positive. So it should take those thinner plants, and I will need to adjust the overall density to get that to fit a little better, and if I have to, maybe bring it down. So let's try -0.5 for the upper and 1 for the lower. And that creates a little more sparseness. Mostly I want to use the alpha to remove density completely. If you have any version prior to 9, there is no alpha for ecosystems. Instead you use basically what I'm using right now, where you set the density to 0 within a function in order to remove the area. But you can set up a specific alpha, which is now separate from the density, to be able to remove areas of instances. It does make it a little bit easier. I do want to set up a slight scale change, just so there's a little more variation throughout. And it doesn't even have to be a big change, just as long as there's something going on. That should look a little bit better. One thing I'm going to do before I show this, the current state, is go to the distribution, and right now we just have this basic noise. And I'm going to go to the preview options and change the object size to 1 so we can see it a little better. The problem is it's too even throughout. So what I want to do is extract the origin and change that constant that's added and replace it with a turbulence node. We're going to change the wavelength down to 0.2, so it's pretty small. We don't want a huge amount of variation, but we want to make sure that we're kind of mixing everything together, so we can maybe multiply that for the combination mode, and that should switch us around the fractal. Now, the preview that you're going to see for turbulence doesn't always reflect the actual material output, so we'll just have to keep an eye on it and see if that's enough. Because we don't want to completely destroy that distribution, but we do need to vary it, because otherwise it's just not enough change. So now you can see the sparseness in the density and the different changes, although I do think it does need to be modified a bit more. What I'm going to do is increase the overall density to 98. That's going to allow it to get much denser, but if we go into the fractal, which is controlling the density, we can then control it numerically and probably get something a little bit better. So let's do -0.8 for the upper value, 0.95 for the lower, and that should make it look a lot better. And I am lagging here because of that Photoshop problem, so I'm going to go ahead and save it and just open it back up. So I'm now going to make a few more changes. I'm lagging a little bit here, and I think it's actually because I'm recording the screen. I'm going to bring down that overall density to 96, and we're also going to edit the alpha and change the scale of the young and 0.05. That should look a lot better. So the alpha we can edit by going to the density. It's already connected to the color map, which is actually just not having any effect at all, but it does show that the alpha is in use. So what we can do is just delete that from the color. And what I want to do is pull out the top portions of that noise. So I'm going to change my object size viewer so that we can see what's actually going on. Go ahead and zoom in. And I've just gone ahead and switched over to the 2D plane preview mode so we can see it a little bit better. And what I want to do is use the threshold filter. So add a filter, set it to threshold. Actually, we could use the smooth threshold. And we want to just grab out those higher peaking areas and connect that to our alpha. So that should create some patches where we have the thinnest or the least dense objects that we created. So using that same control from the presence, we can also have some of them start to be removed so we can have dirt patches showing up. And looks like with the recording I am going to need to change this over to the billboard mode because I am lagging too much and it still might be an issue. So that's just because I'm recording at the moment. Normally it runs very quickly. So I'm going to go back and actually change density to 93, populate, maybe 95, or 94. I don't want to spend too much time tweaking here. Go over to the presence and just make sure everything is opened up all the way. Looks like it is. Scale changes, possibly the young might be too small, so let's try 0.07. Let's go ahead and take Grass BO2 and set it 0.103 and Grass BO1 to 0.12. A little more scale change, and we could set up a fractal for that as well, or a noise to control that. I'm going to go change the up axis only rotation all the way up to 156, so it'll rotate around a little bit more. So the last thing we're going to be customizing is going to be switching out those texture maps and seeing if any more species are needed. There is one other one I had planned to cover the more sparse areas of the population on another layer. So in the next section, we'll take a look at changing the dirt material as well to match along with this population and look a lot better.